Since the mid-1980s, especially in the early 1990s, Western popular music has undergone a significant transformation in content, becoming increasingly violent. This shift is most notably illustrated in the rise of gangster rap and the notorious murder of Tupac Shakur in 1996. Alongside the superstars who primarily sang about love and relationships, there was a growing demand for something more authentic and relevant in people's lives. The days of the poorer social classes were much more permeated by the difficulty of making a living, unemployment, alcohol, drugs, hopelessness, death, and of course crime. When new talents emerged from the ghettos and began to sing about their experiences, people felt the songs resonated with their own lives. However, criminal life was not only present in reality rap. In the American Southwest, in California, and along and across the Mexican border, a much tougher group than street ghetto criminals has increasingly begun to infiltrate everyday life. In addition to Pablo Escobar's drug army, the Mexican cartels have gained an enormous market and influence in human and drug trafficking since the late 1980s. They have become so powerful that there are reports they can even compete with the Mexican army in terms of ground military equipment. Between 2006 and 2020, over 60,000 people went missing, and 40,000 people died in the drug war. These figures do not account for victims outside of the cartels, the army, and the police. If we include civilians, the total number of victims could be 10 times higher. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, however, Mexican cartels were only involved in human trafficking and drug trafficking. Before the end of Prohibition in 1933, alcohol was the main import from the South, but organized crime found a huge market gap and began to smuggle more and more drugs into the United States in the coming years. Their network and influence grew significantly when the Colombians began to pull back at the end of the 1980s. One of the most notable figures in this transformation was Chalino Sánchez. He was also involved in drugs and smuggling, but later became a legendary musician, with songs that continue to attract hundreds of millions of listeners each year. His memory lives across generations. Chalino became a star in the era when the Mexican-American population around Los Angeles, especially the young people, rediscovered the music of their ancestors, reaching back to the corridos, or ballads, of the mid-19th century. For Mexican immigrants, this change also became a movement to strengthen their identity. They chose to listen to their own music, rather than the prevalent rap and pop music, helping them feel more at home in a foreign country. From the mid-19th century on, corridos were inspired by revolutionaries and bandits whose stories were worth telling. The situation has not changed much since then. The gun is still the king in many cases in the Mexican countryside. Chalino and his fellow musicians reformed the genre, but he added a new twist that the feared drug cartels didn't like. This brave innovation made him many enemies throughout his life, and in the end, the cartel simply told him during a performance that he would die that very night. Chalino Sánchez was born Rosalino Sánchez Felix on August 30th, 1960, on a Mexican ranch called El Guayabo on the outskirts of Culiacán in the state of Sinaloa. Culiacán, a city in western Mexico with a population of 1 million, is the capital of Sinaloa. It is known for its beauty, but it also has a reputation for being dangerous. Often referred to as the Mexican Medellin, the city has a long history entwined with cartels and drug trafficking. Chalino was never called Rosalino because he found it too feminine. He was also given the name Marcelino at baptism and raised in Las Flechas, a few minutes north of his birthplace. He was the youngest of 8 siblings, with only one sister. Born into a poor family, he and his family faced many hardships despite the hard work of his parents, Santos and Senorina. Life became even more difficult when his father passed away when the boy was just 6 years old. Chalino only attended school for 3 years, and although he wanted to play music from a young age, His family's dire situation soon led him to commit petty crimes to make money as quickly as possible. Nothing extraordinary at his age, but he was never an innocent child. In 1971, however, when he was 11 years old, his life reached another turning point. In 1967, his sister Juana was raped by some valientes or local dangerous men. Among them was a certain Hector El Chapo Perez, who sent the abused girl home naked. The boy swore revenge that day and had to wait 4 years for the day to come. On November 20th, 1971, he was in El Vizcaino, where the local community celebrated the 1910 Mexican Revolution. Chalino noticed El Chapo sitting next to his two brothers during the festival, and the teenager did not hesitate. He walked up to them and simply shot Hector Perez in the head. A gunfight broke out between the two remaining brothers, Guadalupe and Florencio, and 15-year-old Chalino. In the end, no one was injured, and the boy was able to escape. Although many celebrated his deed, he couldn't stay in the Culiacán area. He was hiding in the surrounding mountains for 2 weeks, after which he set off for the northwestern border city of Tijuana, where he earned money by becoming a coyote, a smuggler of illegal Mexican immigrants to the U.S. In 1977, he also entered the United States at San Isidro and moved to Inglewood, California, to live with his aunt. He continued smuggling with his brother Armando and took on various jobs, but he mainly worked in the harvests from California to Oregon. In 1984, during a simple ceremony with just a few guests, he married Marisela Vallejo, who is often incorrectly identified by various sources as his distant cousin. They first met in 1983, when she worked in the same sewing factory as Chalino's aunt in Inglewood. Marisela was already pregnant with their first child, Adan, at the time of their wedding. The couple later welcomed a daughter named Cynthia as well. In many ways, 1984 was the most important year in Chalino's life. Besides the marriage, his brother was murdered in a Tijuana hotel. Armando himself had become a murderer earlier, when he shot a man with 5 bullets in the late 1970s, and his death was seen by many as revenge for that. The loss of Armando prompted Chalino Sánchez to write his first corrido, and he later dedicated 2 more to his brother. In this genre, the performer tries to sing real stories. While he was serving time in La Mesa prison in Tijuana for minor crimes, he started writing songs for fellow inmates, many of whom were drug traffickers and illiterate, turning their stories into songs. His cousin Ismael played guitar with him in prison, where they made a little money, but sometimes he was compensated with drugs, favors, or guns for the personalized songs. After his release, he washed dishes and sold cars as a side job, and this was when drug dealing as an income source came into the picture, as he sold marijuana and cocaine in small batches. He also continued his musical career, and in 1987, Chalino visited Angel Parra, the owner of San Angel Studio, along with a local norteño group. They recorded 15 corridos, including Armando's, in 4 hours in the Olympic Avenue building. Initially, only 15 copies of the songs were produced, and they had no cover or title, as they were dedicated to the 15 valientes featured in the corridos. However, 6 months later, Sanchez returned with another set of 15 songs. As demand grew, more people began asking for copies, leading to the production of 300 cassettes. Chalino personally went to flea markets to sell the tapes from the trunk of his car. According to his wife, his greatest inspirations often struck him while he was in the restroom or bathroom, where he would frequently spend hours locked away. It's interesting to note that he initially didn't want to sing his own songs, but when the musician he had asked to perform them ultimately stepped back, he had no choice but to take on the role himself. During the same period, he met Pedro Rivera, who made cheap recordings for budding musicians at his small studio, Cintas Aquario. Their friendship evolved to the point where they together created the Corrido Prohibido, which translates to forbidden ballad. In this genre, they mainly sang about drug trafficking and drug-related stories. However, many people strongly disapproved of the new concept, and Chalino was often threatened because he always sided with the victims and called the murderers cowards in his lyrics. Sanchez was a pioneer, and people called him the King of Corrido. He managed to stand out among the Mexican performers who were becoming increasingly Western compatible, yet he still couldn't get his music played on the radio. For that to change, an utterly incredible event had to occur. His popularity among the poorer classes reached the point where young people played his music from their cars almost everywhere. Clubs had to close gates early because the demand for tickets to Chalino concerts was so high that they couldn't accommodate everyone. In January 1992, for example, he was invited to a quinceañera, a private 15th birthday party. Once news spread that he would be performing, hundreds of people flocked to the party, causing chaos and even breaking windows, and ultimately the police had to intervene. As a singer in the American Southwest, he was a valiente himself, and this was not just an image. Unlike the biggest pop stars, he didn't parade around in flashy and shiny clothes. In the sea of cowboy hats, Sanchez dressed like his audience. A friend recalled the slim Chalino was quiet and kind to everyone, but would never run away if someone started picking on him. He also always went to his performances with a gun. On January 25, 1992, he performed in front of 400 people at the Plaza Los Arcos in Coachella, California. It was already around midnight, and Chalino was singing the audience's wishes in his Texan hat, typical norteño clothing, snakeskin boots, and gold chain. At a certain point, a 32-year-old unemployed mechanic named Eduardo Gallegos from Thermal, California, requested the song El Gallo de Sinaloa to be played. However, when it didn't happen, Gallegos, drunk and high on heroin, jumped on stage and shot Chalino with his 25mm pistol. The singer immediately pulled a 10mm gun from his holster and started firing back. Sam Quinones wrote in his 2001 book True Tales from Another Mexico that Chalino told police later that someone gave him the weapon as he walked in, hoping he would wear it on stage, but the gun was actually his, and it was always loaded. The attacker jumped into the screaming, panicked crowd and fired at least a dozen times at Chalino, hitting him twice through the right side of his lung. Chalino was still on stage and shot at Gallegos, who used the crowd as cover. Finally, a bystander overpowered Gallegos and shot him in the mouth with his own pistol, after which the furious crowd began kicking the mechanic. 10 people were injured in the incident, and one of the shots in the leg killed a 20-year-old local man named Claudio Rene Carranza, a father to a 2-month-old baby. He had been dancing with his 18-year-old wife when the bullet hit him. Chalino was transported to the Desert Regional Hospital in Palm Springs in critical condition, where he had to undergo surgery. He was hovering between life and death for 10 days, but ultimately managed to recover. The shootout, on the other hand, gave a significant boost to his music career. National newspapers and TV networks all reported the incident, and from then on, he became notorious. His songs were featured on the radio, although the English-speaking stations played only one of them, the Nieves de Enero, or January Snow. He became so famous that the so-called Chalino style developed among young people, characterized by the Texan hat, the norteño, wide boots, and gold chains. Gallegos was less fortunate. He was taken to the same hospital, and even though he also survived the gunfight, he was never able to explain his actions, and the judge sentenced him to 20 years to life in prison for attempted murder. It wasn't until 2012 that he was first up for parole. It was unsuccessful, but later the LA Times wrote that after 31 years behind bars, the 64-year-old mechanic was released from prison on May 9, 2023. He faced deportation back to Mexico, but his whereabouts became unknown, and none of his relatives could be reached. He told the parole board that on the day he shot Chalino, he started the morning with a beer, then went to a cockfighting match. By the time he got to Plaza Los Arcos that night, he had drunk 30 beers and shot heroin. He was carrying a pistol he'd bought from a paisa who had returned to Mexico. Paisa is the shortened version of paisano, slang for someone from the home country among Mexican Americans. That night was the first time he saw Chalino perform. At his first hearing in 2012, Gallegos said he merely wanted to hand Chalino his gun so he could fire it on stage as he sang, just like they do in Mexico. But what happened was that the singer got scared, and I didn't know that he had a gun also, he said. The mechanic even claimed that he and Sanchez began shooting at the same time. However, years later at another hearing, he told a different story, claiming he asked Chalino to sing a particular song. As the night wore on and the song Gallegos had wanted to hear wasn't played, he started feeling irate. He also felt ignored and eventually climbed on stage and started firing. Israel De Leon, the owner of Los Arcos, was sued by the victims, and he had to sell his properties. In May 1993, $3 million in damages was awarded to the victims, with Claudio Carranza's widow receiving $744,000. The court determined that the venue's owner and security personnel did not do everything they could to prevent the incident, such as not using metal detectors to screen for weapons. Chalino's recovery was relatively short. A few months later, he was back on stage after signing a $115,000 contract with Musart Records, one of Mexico's largest record distributors. He also received $2,000 per corrido, and the company began promoting him. However, he transferred all rights to his songs to Musart. This was a strange move because he demanded upfront money instead of future royalties. As a result, his family would never benefit from the millions of dollars his songs had earned over the years. Additionally, he had given away his expensive weapon collection to acquaintances. Many people thought that after the murder attempt, he was already preparing for death and wanted to collect as much money as possible as quickly as possible. He probably wanted to secure his family's future and bought them a house in Paramount, California. He changed, and 4 months after the shooting and his recovery, Chalino Sánchez accepted a job in Mexico, where public security was even worse than the already weak conditions in the United States. It was a night of performance that continues to haunt his fans and Mexican music to this day. He performed at the concert mainly because he had signed a contract for $20,000, half of which he had already received in advance. That $20,000 would be worth $45,000 at the time of editing this documentary. Another reason was that the venue was practically next to his immediate homeland, as the Sanchez Felix family came from the tiny town of Los Vasitos, which is located right next to Culiacán. Therefore, the singer, whose Sinaloan accent was a rarity, agreed to perform in the Salon Bugambilias. Culiacán, however, is located on one of the main drug smuggling routes. Although guidebooks describe Culiacán as a thriving agricultural city, reports claim it is not uncommon to see plantations protected by gunmen, motorcyclists, and armored vehicles. In the early 90s, the second generation of the Sinaloa cartel was emerging, spearheaded by Amado Carrillo Fuentes, Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. Chalino's acquaintances later said that they tried to talk him out of performing because he had already received death threats from anonymous callers. This was not surprising, since he often sang about the main activities of the cartels and typically sided with the victims. That subgenre is called narcocorridos. According to his wife, Sanchez only responded to the threats by saying, "If God has already decided, then it will happen anyway." The concert started at 10 p.m., and the audience exploded when he took the stage. Everything went normal for quite a long time, with a small portion of the 2,000 guests sitting to the side or in the back, while the majority danced in front of the band. Chalino was already over many songs, when out of nowhere, and before Alma Enamorada, or Soul in Love, a stranger from the crowd handed him a small piece of paper. He paused for a moment to read the note, likely expecting it to contain a song title. Instead, he scratched his head, folded the note, and glanced around nervously. It was only later that the contents of the paper were revealed. Sources claim that at the end of the concert, he told his brothers present that the cartel had messaged him that he would die that night if he did not finish the performance immediately. We will never know what was written on the paper, because Chalino Sánchez eventually continued singing, and the video recording of the concert shows him crumpling up the message a little later and throwing it away. Since it is known what happened next, the written death penalty is very likely, but it is also possible that someone just asked for a song. After a short toast following the performance, he left for home around midnight with his two brothers, Espiridion and Francisco, his cousin Carmelo Felix, and a few young women, including his girlfriend from Culiacán. However, at a traffic light in the center of Culiacán, near the Cuauhtémoc statue, their car was approached by several Dodge Ram Chargers or Chevrolet Suburbans without license plates. Sources vary on the brand. Multiple gunmen got out of the vehicles and dragged Espiridion out of the car. One of them showed a state police ID and told the group that their commander wanted to meet the famous singer. At first, the Sanchez brothers wanted to bribe the strangers, as this was not uncommon in Mexico, but they refused, and the man with the ID said, quote, "My comandante needs you." Chalino probably already knew what was about to happen, so he began to beg them to let Espiridion go, whom they probably did not know was his brother. Chalino told them that Espiridion had done nothing and that he had only met him at the concert. Sanchez continued to talk to the gunman for a while and ultimately got into one of their SUVs. Carmelo Felix later recalled that the unknown men were all really young. Maybe one or two of them were real police officers, while the rest were so-called madrinas, simple criminals, or even cartel soldiers hired by the Mexican police to do their dirty work for them. The shadowy figures eventually drove north with Chalino. The body of the 31-year-old corrido singer was discovered by two campesinos or farm workers around 6 a.m. by an irrigation canal next to Federal Highway 15, near the city's Los Laureles neighborhood. He was found blindfolded, with rope marks on his wrists, 2 gunshot wounds to the back of his head, and signs of torture. His killers beat him so severely that authorities could only identify him by a cross tattoo above his heel. The perpetrators were never caught, although the murder method leaves little doubt. The level of brutality clearly points to the Sinaloa cartel, but some speculated that relatives of El Chapo Perez might have taken revenge. However, the two theories are not mutually exclusive. News of his death spread rapidly through Culiacán and Los Angeles, where fans took to the streets, blasting Chalino's songs from their cars for days. In Los Angeles, men mourned him, while young girls and women cried in his memory, and his label began promoting the murdered star even more. He was buried in Los Vasitos beside his father and brother Armando. However, the family tragedies did not end there. In March 2004, Chalino's son Adán, who also sang drug ballads and his father's compositions, was involved in a highly suspicious car accident in an almost deserted area near Culiacán. No one understood what he was doing there. He was traveling in a Ford Crown Victoria with a driver and his manager, Lorena Rodriguez, when they went off the road at high speed, and Adán was thrown from the vehicle. The other two survived the accident, but Chalino Chico, as Adán was nicknamed, died from his skull injuries. He was also buried in the white Sanchez Felix mausoleum. Chalino Sánchez's records have sold in millions since his barbaric execution, and his popularity is unbroken to this day. He emerged as a martyr and a symbol of resilience, reflecting the hardships of life through his corridos. Chalino became a legendary singer, although he never viewed himself as one. He inspired many and is regarded as one of Mexico's most important and influential musicians, who met his fate because he never ran away.